Now, mumps has seen quite a spike up in Canada in recent months, with outbreaks being reported in Toronto, Manitoba, and Alberta. My first guest, calling from Toronto, will give us some insight on the increases being seen in Canada. Joining me now is the Germ Guy, Jason Tetro. Jason is a visiting scientist at the University of Guelph. Hi, Jason. Welcome to the program.
Well, hello there. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we've chatted here and there, time and again, but this is the first time I actually got you on the show, and I'm really excited about that.
Well, anything that ends up swelling male hormones and gonads is always a good reason to get on the radio.
There you go. And soon the audience will understand what he's talking about. Okay. Now, so before we look at the reasons mumps has been on the rise, not only here in the U.S., but also in Canada, Jason, can you give my audience a primer on mumps? You know, how it's transmitted, symptoms, and complications, etc.
Sure. Well, mumps virus, we call it a paramyxovirus, but what this really means is that it's a virus that transmits essentially through bodily fluids. And this particular virus is really in the saliva. And the reason for that is because when the virus gets into your body, so you've come into contact with some type of saliva that's contaminated, and then it gets into your mouth, it'll get into your skin on the inside, the epithelial cells, and it'll eventually go to the lymph nodes, the glands. Now, there are some glands that are just under your chin called the parotid glands. They're your salivary glands, basically. And that's where this virus really likes to infect. And over time, what will happen is as this virus continues to grow, unfortunately, so do your glands. And that's why you get that traditional chipmunk cheek that you see whether you happen to be a child or Sidney Crosby of the Pittsburgh Penguins. So what happens after that is that your immune system essentially tries to fight it off. And as it does it, there's sort of an evasion that occurs with the virus so that it can utilize those particular cells that are trying to fight it to spread. And it can spread to a number of different areas in the body, one of which happens to be the reproductive organs of both men and women, and unfortunately that also leads to swelling. Another is the brain, and you do have the potential risk for meningitis, and another is the pancreas. And when mumps was rampant, it was actually known as a potential cause for juvenile or type 1 diabetes. So when the virus gets inside of you, unless you have either seen it before or you have some kind of protection, otherwise known as a vaccine, these potentially can occur inside of you. And what makes it so troublesome is that even though you may have the virus, you may not know that you have it for upwards of 2 weeks, and yet you may still be infectious within about a week to 10 days. So you could be spreading this without even realizing that you know it. And that's why it's one of these almost perfect outbreak-style viruses, because it can actually be a silent spreader. So when you think about mumps, even though, it may lead to a little bit of, jocular humor and such when it comes to men, it really is a serious disease in pediatrics and also in those people who are in their 20s and 30s who may not be properly protected.
All right. Well, let's take a look at what's going on in Canada. Am I correct? Are we really seeing an increase in mumps in Canada?
Yeah. Well, what's happening is that for the longest time, we didn't really see that many cases. And then about 10 years ago, something happened, and we started seeing little pockets arriving. Now, the pockets weren't really that problematic. However, in the last 10 years, we've seen the number of pockets grow, but also the number of people within those pockets. Now, normally, we would have thought that this would have occurred in schools and colleges. However, more recently, as we saw here in Toronto, mumps is being spread in some areas that you may not imagine, such as the bar scene. Mm-hmm. We actually had several bars in one area of the city that ended up having, I believe it was 14 cases, and then there were a few more secondaries after that. We still are seeing it in schools, and as many people probably have heard in the past few years, we do see it in sporting events such as hockey players because, there's lots of saliva being thrown around there. And when you come to, the epidemiological analysis, we are seeing greater number of cases. So in a way, you could say that mumps has made some kind of a comeback, but it's not for the reasons many people think that it is the case.
Right, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, you're in Toronto. Mumps is typically thought of as a very mild disease. So what's the concern that you see among the public?
Well, the public is really concerned. To be honest with you, let me give you an example.
Sure.
Here in Toronto, when we had those 14 cases occur, there wasn't really much made about it. And then all of a sudden, we started hearing about the secondary symptoms. And by that, I mean the swelling of the reproductive organs. The minute that happened, it was all over the news.
Sure.
Now, you could call this, just perhaps an enlargement of the outbreak interest. I don't know. But what it did show is that most people don't seem to think about the parotid glands as being a problem. But when it starts actually affecting other areas of the body, and you start to realize that it's not just affecting one spot, it becomes problematic, and then people begin to become more concerned.
And what kind of job is the public health officials doing up there?
They are doing their best. When it comes to something like mumps, because it is that sort of perfect outbreak virus, there's only a couple of options that you have. One is, of course, to promote vaccination, and the other is to promote behavioral change so that you are not sharing saliva. And I don't know, the last time I went out drinking to a bar probably was a long time ago, so I don't know what the bar culture is like, but I don't think that people are, standing with a certain space between them, and they're not, they're making sure not to share their drinks,
Now, you did an article recently in Huffington Post Canada, which hat tip to you. It was very, very good. And for my audience, I will post a link to it when I publish the podcast later on the website. And you say in the mid-2000s, we started seeing these increases in mumps. You kind of alluded to it already, even in those vaccinated, which we're seeing a lot today. However, you discussed an issue that many in the public may not be aware of, that the virus may have changed. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me take you back, first of all, to 1963. There was a young girl. Her name was Gerald Lynn, and her father happened to be a vaccine maker. Well, she ended up getting the mumps, and he decided that, well, as a vaccine maker, let's see if I can make a vaccine for the mumps. And he did. And it was called the Gerald Lynn strain for the mumps vaccine. And that's the same vaccine that we're currently using today in North America. Now, back then, there was only one type of mumps that anyone really knew of. But over the next few decades, what ended up happening was, thanks to genetic research, we actually began to realize that, well, there was more than just one type of virus, mumps virus. In fact, there were 12. And we call these genotypes. Now, the Gerald Lynn strain was actually known as the A genotype when nomenclature was made. And that's great. So if the A genotype is circulating, you're going to be protected against it, almost 100%. But the one that is circulating as of the mid-2000s is a completely different type. It's called the G genotype. And this one looks and acts differently than the A genotype. And unfortunately, the ability of your immune system that's been vaccinated to fight it is only about 50% effective.
And why is that?
Now, well, the reason is that when you actually look at the structure of the virus at the protein level, The A differs a little bit from the G, but not entirely. So there's what we call cross-reactivity. Mm-hmm. So that means that if you have antibodies against the A, your antibodies will recognize the G. The problem is, however, that we now know that when you have a vaccine, over time against mumps, it will wane. Your immunity will become less and less effective against the virus. And upwards to 10 years later, you may only have about half to a third of the original immunity. Now, you cut that in half, and all of a sudden you realize you're working not with a full deck, you're actually working with something that may not be able to stop this virus from infecting you. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we've been seeing, is it's not a question of, lack of vaccination or under vaccination. It's actually a question of whether or not your immune system is strong enough to be able to be at that 50% that's necessary to stop this G genotype. And unfortunately, for people in their 20s and their 30s, even though they may have had the two vaccines, the MMR, they may still not have enough. And so this has really opened up quite a bit of discussion, but also a little bit of concern, because we already are facing, a hesitant vaccine population. And now what we're trying to do is essentially say, well, the odds are you may have to get yet a third shot just to be able to fight off this G genotype. So in as much as, the Toronto public health officials and public health officials all over North America are doing their best, the odds may be stacked against them.
Right. And you mentioned a booster shot, and we're seeing in all these universities here in the U.S., at least, mm-hmm. When they just experience these outbreaks, they are recommending a third shot, a booster vaccine. Is there any evidence that this is effective?
Yes. There have been a few papers that have been published in the academic literature that have shown that if you provide this third dose, then what ends up happening is that you can actually cut down on the number of cases that are happening. But more importantly, what you're doing is you're actually bumping up that immunity in order to be able to fight off the G genotype. So while the discussions may be ongoing as to whether or not we should be mandating as a form of policy a third shot instead of, a case-by-case or outbreak-by-outbreak basis, mm-hmm. one thing that we do know is that third shot is effective. So while the people who are sitting down around tables talking about this, figure it out, if you happen to be in an environment where mumps is spreading and you haven't had that second shot in, 10 years or so, I really would suggest going to talk to your doctor about getting that third one.
Okay, good. Now, you kind of talked about this already, but other than vaccination, can you spell out really what people can do to help them prevent mumps?
Yeah, it's very, very simple. Don't share bodily fluids.
Well,
I know it's the most simple one, and it's also the most difficult one, because that type of behavioral change is really, really tough. Because while we may not be going around and kissing people on a regular basis, we may share utensils. We may allow people to take sips from our glasses. We may be around people while we're exercising and not even realize that, a certain amount of our sweat and our saliva is being spread. So the thing is that, this concept of having to have almost a sterile environment around you is just simply ludicrous to think about. Mm-hmm. So you have to find that common medium whereby, you're still being socially active, but by the same respect, you're being careful not to come into contact with any of these saliva droplets that are around. And of course, the best way to do that is, to wash your hands with soap and water, or even use hand sanitizer for 15 seconds. Make sure that it's 62 to 70% alcohol. And don't let anything around your mouth that you wouldn't really want to have there in the first place.
All right. Well, good advice. All right. And I got about 4 minutes left, Jason, and I know on my website when I publish news about outbreaks across the U.S. and Canada, frequently it's noted that 60 to 70% of those infected were fully vaccinated with the 2 MMRs. Mm-hmm. That always brings on one of the people from the anti-vaccination crowd, and they chime in making derogatory comments about getting vaccinated. Mm-hmm. As a scientist, Jason, what do you say to them and the public at large?
Well, let me just tell you one thing. The anti-vaccine or vaccine hesitancy, vaccine denial, whatever you want to call it, movement seems to have an interesting perspective about themselves. And the reason is, I've been talking about mumps now for probably close to a month and a half. And as always, when I'm going out into the public to talk about vaccines, I ready myself. I get myself prepared because I know that there are going to be those people who are going to come at me. They're going to call me names. They're going to say I'm shilling for certain types of pharmaceutical companies. They'll even say that I'm purposely trying to spread infections so that I can promote vaccines. It's happened before. It'll probably happen again. And yet, I go out into the public to talk about mumps over these last 6 weeks or so, and I've yet to hear a peep from any of these individuals. And you know why?
I'd love to hear it.
Because they understand that the risk to certain sensitive areas of their bodies is greater than the risk of having a vaccine. And this is something that I want your listeners to understand. Inasmuch as we know that these people are constantly crying out and constantly saying all sorts of derogatory things about vaccination, they are usually the people who are first in line when there actually is a true threat to health. Whether it be the pandemic flu from 2009-2010, whether it be the mumps that's circulating now, and I can guarantee you, if yellow fever, which is currently down in Brazil, starts making its way up towards the United States, just like Zika did last year, mm-hmm. they will be asking for stockpiles of that yellow fever vaccine. So if you happen to be a person who promotes vaccination and you find that these people are up against you, just throw them something, whether it be yellow fever, pandemic influenza, mumps, Ebola, and see what they have to say about that. Because at the end of the day, they are promoting an ideology that only fits in an environment that is healthy and there is no risk for society. The minute that risk to society is clicked or turned on, all of a sudden all those arguments go away and they're more than happy to lift up their arms in order to get a shot.
Good point.
So I think that's something people who are listening to this show really need to take to heart and realize that if you happen to be up against something along those lines of an anti-vaccine rant, just realize, for the most part, it's not really going to have much effect.
Yeah. All right. Well, I encourage everybody to go to the Huffington Post Canada and check out Jason's different posts. They're all very, very good. Do you publish anywhere else, Jason?
I'm mainly, from a publishing side, Huffington Post. The rest of the work that I do in the media is usually on radio or television. Right. But if you happen to, just Google News me, you'll be probably finding a whole bunch of different articles I've either written or interviews in which I provided comment on some very interesting perspectives on human health with a little bit of a focus on microbiology.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you, Jason Tetro, for your time and expertise, sir. I appreciate it.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Have yourself a wonderful day.
Thank you, sir.